Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Frank Luntz, pollster, communications analyst, a man who is deeply passionate about public opinion and whether we're on the right track. It's always a pleasure to speak to you, Frank. We're going to start, of course, with the decision in Colorado to block Trump from the ballot next year. In some ways, the reactions along the same tribal lines we always talk about. Are we focused on the right things?
Well, this is certainly a challenge to our democratic process. And I find it frightening that people have already made their decisions without knowing the full story, without reading why the decision was made, without understanding the ramifications of that decision, and looking at the consequences, not just for that one state and that one decision, but for American politics and elections for the long term. I've talked to my colleagues in the polling profession who've been in the field since that decision was made 48 hours ago. And they tell me that it hasn't changed the numbers, but it absolutely has changed intensity. Whereas you had 70% of Trump voters that were absolutely determined to vote for him, that 70% is now up into the mid 80s. And those who are going to vote against him, their intensity has grown as well. Fewer undecided voters, fewer people that are going to listen to the arguments, and more people that have made up their minds and don't have any desire to hear an alternative point of view. And that, to me, as an academic, as a professor, that's frightening. For in the end, elections absolutely matter. But American democracy and our future matters even more.
It's almost an existential challenge because in the courts, of course, they're trying to do what they feel is legally appropriate, citing Article 3, the 14th Amendment, a lot of debate about that and what the Supreme Court will do. How much, we could have anticipated this. We've talked in the past about the fact that every time there is a decision against Trump, it reinforces this idea of him being a victim, of there being a deep state against him. So perhaps we're not surprised by the outcome. Should it have been approached differently? Should it have been avoided in the first place?
You can't avoid, if something's wrong, and I'm not passing judgment on this decision, but if something's wrong, you can't avoid it, even if it causes discomfort. And in this case, it could cause chaos. In fact, I can see a situation where the Supreme Court reviews this and precipitates even something close to a constitutional crisis, because this is redefining the electoral process so close to and it will be redefining it as the election is going on. And that's going to add passion. It's going to add division to whatever happens. And so I am concerned about that. But the fact is, there are other states that looked at this and said no, that it is not justified. You've got judges and legal scholars on both sides of the aisle that have a problem with this decision. And what we don't need right now is more chaos in our political system. What we really need is clarity. And this is not going to add to the clarity in any sense of the word.
Before we move on, can I go back to the first principles of, given the intention of Article 3, obviously it was forged, just a few years after the Civil War, so that context I think is important. This is a unique case in which it can be deployed. So in what way does it actually change the electoral process? Is it court interference with primaries, elections? Is that the way in which we should be concerned?
Shouldn't voters decide who they're voting for? Do we really want courts to make that decision? Do we really want courts to play that game, to take people out of politics, out of the ballot process? I'm not sure about that. I do know that things have changed since Article 3 and since the 14th Amendment was ratified. Obviously, there are strict constructionists who believe in the original intent, and that matters as well. I just think that you're throwing in a really dangerous wrinkle right now that does benefit Donald Trump in the short run, that creates a level of distrust towards our electoral process, which is really damaging in the long run And how the Supreme Court handles this, their decision making, the context that they use to explain their point of view is truthfully, significantly more important than anything that they've done since overturning Roe v. Wade, because all of America is going to be watching and all of America is going to be responding, whatever they decide to do.
Let's assume some of those justices or their aides are watching this. What advice do you have in terms of the language that takes us to where we need to go?
I love that question. It's why I like doing these interviews. And I'm surprised because I've been on a whole bunch of different shows and no one's asked me that question. The first thing is to explain why you're hearing the case. They have to set the context from the outset because Donald Trump will do it for them if they don't. And in fact, that's one of the biggest changes to our political system. You cannot wait weeks or days or even hours. When you make a decision, whether or not it's to hear the case, how you're going to adjudicate it, the decision-making process, you have to explain it. You must set the context because only the Supreme Court has the responsibility for the rule of law. It's not Congress's job. That's not the state's job. That is the Supreme Court, the ultimate rule of law. And if they don't explain it in plain English, and this is not a duck of your question, I don't know what they're going to do. But I do know that the average individual needs to understand why they came to their decisions through this process, because if they don't, then I can promise you that chaos is going to be the result.
You know, there's been a lot of discussion about the politicization of the Supreme Court, too, and they're obviously hearing a case right now with special counsel Jack Smith around essentially accelerating a decision around immunity for the former president. I'm curious, when you hear grumblings like, for example, that Justice Thomas should recuse himself from making a decision because of his wife's involvement, are we getting into the weeds a bit? I mean, is this a case where all justices need to weigh in? We need to hear from them?
Yes, and I'd even say that every justice should write. Let me answer the question just before this, because I didn't give a clear enough answer. All justices should weigh in. I think this is the kind of decision, this game changer, because it's going to have an impact on the outcome of the election. And nothing is more essential to the successful operation of a democracy than the successful operation of the electoral process. I would love to see every justice weigh in, every justice explain why they came to their point of view. I know that represents an awful lot of content, but on a decision like this, if CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and all the networks and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, if everyone is to report on it, if the universities are to analyze it, if the American voters are to understand it, they do need the context. So if they're listening right now, I'd say get your pens and your computers ready, because you owe us. We deserve an explanation for why you've made the decision. And even if it means explaining why you're not going to hear the case, each one of you needs to tell us why.
This has not been a year or a few years where we've seen a triumph of nuance, Frank. So I don't mean to, of course, I think for the records, for legacy, for the importance of how we think about our democracy and how the rest of the world feels we're handling it, it's very important. Do you think it will make a difference with those groups that you mentioned at the start that have essentially made up their minds and, if anything, are doubling down on their decision?
They are doubling down, and that level of intensity is frightening. But it's not just for posterity or for legacy, that there are people who want to know the truth. It's the highest value that Americans want in the democracy right now. And it supersedes every other value: fairness, justice, accountability. Truth matters most. And we should give the public what it wants. And I can't think of a better way to identify the truth than for the Supreme Court to explain it in tremendous detail, knowing that the average American won't read it, knowing that the average American actually has made up their minds and doesn't care, because in the end, even if it impacts 1%, the 1% that is searching for the truth needs to be able to find it. And that's the responsibility of the three branches of government. You're correct. The Supreme Court's credibility has been crushed over the last 2 years. And this is an opportunity for them to once again reassert their value, their legacy, why they matter so much to the successful functioning of a government that frankly isn't particularly successful and isn't particularly functioning right now.
What about advice for the Republican Party? And of course, by that I mean both the nominees, the apparatus of the party. I mean, there's this Faustian pact to some extent, and you could say that with both parties, of course. But Trump is leading in the polls. We've talked about that in the past. What is the right reaction right now? We've seen, Vivek Ramaswamy, for example, calling for all of the, candidates to pull out of Colorado for the primaries. I mean, I'm curious for the long-term health of the party, especially in your, prior role of being very close to being a GOP strategist. How do you think about that if you were in the driver's seat, so to speak, in terms of navigating from here?
Well, I'm not in the driver's seat. I'm not even a passenger. I'm barely on the road at this point, and I don't miss it because I don't see this as a Republican decision or a Republican strategy or a Democratic strategy. I think that that's part of the problem, is that we're approaching these things not from the basis of what's good for the country, what's good for the democracy, what's good for the electoral process. We're approaching it as what's good for Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And that's exactly what got us into trouble in the first place. That I am begging people to stop looking at Election Day 2024 as the be all and end all, and start accepting that if we get this wrong over the next 11 months, if we blow it, we may not get another chance 4 years from now. I am generally frightened that if we have another election like 2020, where one or both candidates challenge the results, where we have an insurrection, where people simply turn against the system and stop believing, I question whether we can bring them back. And so whenever I'm put into the situation of partisanship, I reject it. I think that's part of the problem rather than part of the solution.
What about the federal versus state level? This was obviously a state level decision. We're seeing other states, like the Texas Attorney General is now making similar threats, perhaps empty, but nevertheless, it has stirred the pot at that level. When you think about the different levels of government and the roles they play in getting us to where we need to go, what do you think about that?
I'm asking people basically to be silent for a little bit. Don't jump just because someone said something or did something that seems wrong or extreme. And in the end, we are a United States, but we are a nation of states. I don't want to see the state governments, their powers usurped by the federal government. And yet I want to see a standard that exists across the country, so that every citizen in every community, in every corner of the country, knows exactly what to expect from the democratic process. And yet the laws and the rules are still determined state by state as the framers of the Constitution intended. I think right now we're having the worst of all worlds. We've got federal versus state. And that's part of why I'm so concerned about this specific moment in this election cycle.
I don't know if the term green shoots is appropriate here, but are you seeing anything that gives you some glimmer of hope if you were to look for where there is evidence that we can recover from this? Where would it be?
If you had asked me this 10 days ago, I would have said no. If you had asked me this even 48 hours ago, I would have said no. But over the last 48 hours, I've discovered dozens of organizations that have formed for the specific purpose of improving our democracy, of finding common ground, common purpose, of lowering the decibel level, of learning how to disagree without being disagreeable. One of the organizations is coming out of the National Governors Association. The NGA president and vice president, Spencer Cox from Utah, and Governor Polis from Colorado, Jared Polis, they're working together to find an approach that doesn't destroy our country in every election cycle. And they're leading an effort, but there's so many more efforts just like that. So clearly the American people are saying enough is enough. And that at some point, if they get strong enough, they'll be able to say to our Democratic nominee and our Republican nominee a single word, and they'll put their hands up and they'll face them towards the two candidates and simply say, enough. Enough ugliness, enough partisanship, enough tearing each other apart, just enough. Get the job done. Do what you promised to do. Don't demonize the other side. They're not evil. They may be wrong, but they're not evil. And stop with this, not just polarization, but poison that they have injected into our body politic.
I want to step away from partisan politics for a second to the geopolitical landscape, because I know you've been quite involved with regards to the consequences of the Israel-Hamas war, and that is, a different type, of course, of polarization, I suppose you could say. How is that going to impact the political landscape? And just, again, are we focused on the right issues?
What shocked me, and it didn't matter whether the students from universities in the Northeast or from California or the South or anywhere in between, Democratic students, Republican students, graduates, undergraduates, is that everyone, without exception, believes the current discussion on the college campuses about Hamas and Israel is destructive rather than constructive, and that the university is supposed to be the place of wisdom and knowledge where people can have these tough conversations and not destroy each other. And that's not happening, whether it's Harvard or Stanford or Georgetown, GW, University of Maryland, USC, some of the UC colleges. It's not happening. And the students see it, and it bothers them, it frightens them. And it's another example of the disintegration of civility and the breakdown, in this case, of our educational process.
You talk about trust and the importance of that. And, I know I'm spanning the landscape here, but I'm thinking about the current situation with Harvard President Claudine Gay. And, in essence, a congressional testimony has spawned, fresh accusations of plagiarism. And, I don't know to wade into the specifics of that, but when you think about the leadership of colleges, whether it's specific to President Gay or in general, how do they pivot? Because it starts at the top.
I would say to every university president, and I'm sure some of them listen to this program, your words matter and your actions matter. And some universities, as our students told us, are simply disengaged, uninvolved, because the presidents don't want to risk losing their jobs. But their job is to put themselves at risk. Their job is to engage with the students, to ensure that every student feels heard, every student feels protected. Doesn't mean that you're going to agree, and students need to learn to stop being snowflakes, to stop taking every challenge, every criticism as the biggest thing that's ever happened, either to themselves or to that university. But that said, universities have to be the focal point for public debate and conversation. And any student who's afraid to leave their room, who gets abused by a professor, who gets physically accosted, and this is happening all across the country, that is the university president's responsibility. You're not just there to raise money. You're not there to send out the annual reports. You're there to ensure that your students exceed and excel in their educational experience. And frankly, we should only have people leading these universities who are both exceptional and extraordinary. And what we're learning right now is some of them have stellar academic records, but they don't and won't learn how to teach.
Yeah, and it gets back to trust. I want to circle back, to finish the conversation around the topic of civility again. And really what comes to mind is the word cruelty and some of the rhetoric that we're hearing, both in the campaign trail, obviously on the streets, in the news. There have been a lot of, references once again to Hitler with regard to some of that rhetoric. I would like to level set, again, what's on your radar as you think about some of the ways that we can navigate back to that common village green and really avoid demonizing fellow citizens for their beliefs?
I attend every rally I can on all sides of an issue. And so far, so good. I've not been recognized, and I'm able to listen to and learn from the speeches, the protests on all sides of all of these issues. But the one that concerns me the most is the phrase, by any means necessary. And that's being used by supporters of Hamas to justify what happened to Israel on October 7th. By any means possible is not a statement, it is a declaration of support for violent activity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where democracies break down. That's where you undermine the whole purpose of being given the right to state your point of view and being given the benefit, the privilege of living in a democracy. And I'm afraid that there are too many people applying that principle, by any means possible, by any means necessary, in how they engage in politics. So my warning to those listening today is that you will reap what you sow if you believe and if you articulate extreme points of view in defense of where you stand and where you sit. Don't be surprised if it comes back at you. And if you teach intolerance, that's exactly what the community we call America, that's exactly what we will learn, and we will all pay a price for that.
As always, I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Frank, and definitely I'd love to continue to also speak with you and also speak to some of the students and others that you're talking with.
It's important to me that I give them their voice, that I not speak for them, but I give them a microphone so they can be heard. And I think this is the perfect format for that.